Hello and welcome to the Employment Group podcast from DMH Stallard, the latest in our series of episodes. Today is going to be on the subject of third-party harassment. What is the true extent of an employer's duty to prevent it and protect staff? And what are the true costs of getting it wrong or just being plain unlucky in relation to harassment in the workplace? The law underpinning an employer's responsibility in this area is complex, arising principally from a combination of implied duties around duty to provide a safe working environment for staff, interwoven with obligations under the law of tort, principally not to fail to take steps to prevent a reasonably foreseeable risk of harm. But it's not just in the courts and tribunals that these issues bite, and that's all too apparent at the moment from recent press attention there's been around the McDonald's case, and reports and investigations now happening internally into harassment suffered by staff within a franchise network, complicated further by the fact that the franchise network has effectively separate employers within it rather than being something that's totally under the control of McDonald's as a corporation. So there are very real and tangible reputational and therefore commercial impacts as well, not just the law sitting underneath it and technical breaches. So there's a lot for us to take a look at today. So how do we build a picture? This is one of the questions we'll ask ourselves today. How do we build a clear picture of the extent and limits of our duties as an employer? And what measures can we take that will meaningfully reduce the risk? And at the same time, I suppose, better position us to show that we have met rather or exceed our duties. And with me to discuss the current state of third-party harassment in the workplace are Rebecca Thornley-Gibson, partner in the employment team with over 30 years experience of seeing, as she puts it, the good, the bad, and the downright ugly in employee relations. And there's going to be some ugly today, I'm sure, when we're talking about third-party harassment. So Rebecca has significant experience working with large employers, including dealing with complex and contentious harassment allegations. So very well placed to talk through these issues. And we also have Will Walsh, partner in the employment group, specialising in employment law for over 20 years. And during that time, Will's advised a number of clients with particularly knotty harassment allegations, helping them to deal not only with the internal staffing matters that come from that, but also with the external PR issues, which can be so important and sit alongside allegations like these. So, Will, I'll start with you. Do you think that when we think about the current legislative framework, I should say, do we think that that is fit for purpose? Does it need to be strengthened to ensure that employers do more to protect individuals from third-party harassment? I suppose the McDonald's case begs that question very much. So is it strong enough, or does more need to be done?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, Adam. Very recent developments in terms of proposed new legislation that are being pushed through, which, as I'll explain in just a moment, many will think that the current proposals are not quite strong enough, and certainly not as strong as they did look at certainly at the beginning of the year. Just to recap on what those are, is that, say, at the start of the year, we expected new legislation on third-party harassment in particular. Um, and what was proposed originally was that there's going to be new laws to introduce the concept or reintroduce the concept of employer liability for third-party harassment, so harassment of employees by customers, by members of the public. There's going to be liability for employers. That was one thing that was being looked at. And then a second obligation for all employers to take positive steps to take all reasonable steps to avoid sexual harassment in the workplace, and that went sort of hand in hand with a penalty of uplift in compensation of up to 25% for those who don't take all reasonable steps to prevent. So that all looked quite positive. But as of last week, the House of Lords have looked at the new bill and proposed amendments, which do now look like will be the version that goes through and gets approved by government.
Mm.
And for those who've been pushing for these changes, will certainly come away feeling a little bit disappointed, to say the least, in that there's the version that's going through looks a lot more watered down. And what that looks like is, first of all, the third-party harassment part is not going through, so that's been dropped altogether.
Completely
Um,
gone. Will.
Completely gone, exactly. So that's disappeared. Logic being the main reason that there was reticence to put that through. It came down to freedom of speech. And the thought that it got too complex because this was not just sexual harassment, it was covering all types of harassment. So the fear was that someone could overhear a conversation about political views, moral views, those sorts of things, and then hold their employer liable for a conversation held by a member of the public, for example. And it just went too far. The government had looked to try to put carve-outs in to cover to deal with those particular concerns, but it just got too complicated, and it would be far too much for the tribunals trying to sort out the boundaries on there. So it decided that was too complicated, and that part. So the party harassment was dropped altogether. That said, it doesn't mean that employers are off the hook altogether. So that if an employee was being subjected to continual harassment by third parties and they did nothing whatsoever to protect their staff, then you could get into a place where the employer could be seen as condoning that type of behaviour and become liable themselves that way. But that's fairly technical, and fairly limited. So that being dropped out, certainly say will be of considerable disappointment for those who are pushing for it. The other limb of it, in terms of the positive step to take steps to prevent sexual harassment, that stays in, but it has been watered down slightly. The language has changed from employers having a duty to take all reasonable steps to employers have a duty to take reasonable steps. So the word of all reasonable steps part has disappeared. Again, the logic being, I'm not sure I entirely agree with it, but an impossible duty on employers. In practice, though, I'm not sure that particular part makes a huge amount of difference. I don't think there's going to be an enormous number of cases that fall in that particular gap. It tends to be the case that employers, when they fail absolutely, or an employer will have taken steps to avoid harassment from taking place. I think it's unlikely you're going to get many that there's going to be criticism that yes, you took reasonable steps to avoid harassment, but we don't we don't think you took all reasonable steps. So I don't see that one as a hugely significant change in terms of that. And then interestingly, on the third party harassment point, part of the commentary at the House of Lords was the fact that, well, part of taking reasonable steps to avoid harassment in the workplace could include taking steps to avoid harassment from third parties as well. So
Mm.
time will tell how that pans out. But again, given that the strict liability for third party acts has been scrapped, it's certainly going to be fairly limited. And then the final part is the 25% uplift that remains. So that will
Okay.
still be there.
So that's quite welcome for employers if the uplift remains, because all reasonable steps, that sort of concept has been debated in the courts, not just in employment law, hasn't it, for years. It takes you into territory of sort of another phrase of best endeavours, quite a high
Yes.
burden. So reasonable steps may actually be something that's more manageable and realistic for employers, I suppose, particularly where they have the threat of the uplift. So um, depending on your perspective on this as an employer, that might be a welcome development there. Well, do we have a timeline? Really, I know it's so hard, isn't it, to predict a timeline for most of these proposals at the moment. We've got an election coming up as well in a couple of years. So
Yeah, exactly. And interesting on the election, again, your first question, timeline, no, there's nothing solid. Typically, these things tend to come in either spring or autumn. So I guess autumn is a reasonable guess. The government have pretty much confirmed that they are backing the House of Lords changes. And on your election point, the Labour government, the Labour Party have also confirmed that they will back the bill as is now and now amended. However, they did add the comment that it is also something that they would plan to revisit if and when elected next time around. So again, certainly watch this space in terms of further developments and whether it does go further in a year or so's time.
oh, that's very helpful to know that insight. Well, but yeah, a dollop of wiggle room there by the sounds from the
Yeah.
Labour government in terms of changing position. But we've got a couple of questions we want to talk about. I'm really keen that we touch on the issue of the wider risks around harassment and third-party harassment, in particular around the perception of you as an employer, other risks around reputational, etc. And well, you've got some specific experience working with clients on that, as we mentioned earlier. But before we do that, I just wanted to jump to this issue of taking things as they stand today, Rebecca. how far does the employer duty go? You've got work events that we've talked in the past. Listeners will be familiar with the extension of the workplace and course of employment. We've also had cases of horrendous things happening on petrol station forecourts. So, is it reasonable to expect employers to police everything? Is that a interpretation of where the level of duty is for employers right now, particularly for third parties?
Yes, hi Adam. I think quite often employers do feel as though they have to, or they're put in a position where they feel as though they have to police everything. The ability to say sorry, but this didn't happen on our watch, or you shouldn't have been doing that anyway. It's not our fault. Is something that it's quite hard for an employer to use that approach, take that approach now. So I think, how far does the employer duty go? Well, it's all about, did the act um, take place in the course of employment? And then that course of employment is subject then to lots of debate about what is in the course of employment. And probably the most common examples that we get asked to advise on is those what we call sort of probably sort of hybrid social work events. So a team arranged outing after work, something like that. And employers then might be supplying the event with alcohol. It's usually in a fairly relaxed, environment setting. People are letting their hair down, and people just seem to sort of let their guard down, and that includes managers as well, that perhaps could step in those situations when they see things starting to perhaps um, um, sort of go beyond the bounds of sort of the expectations of reasonable and respectful behaviour, and they don't necessarily see the red flags that they might have seen if it was in the workplace. And
Mm,
if it was in the workplace as well, people tend to sort of realise that they're perhaps under what they consider to be a higher duty to just, well, they're getting on with their work, and the time and place for comments and what might be considered as sort of um, workplace sort of banter and perhaps slightly more immature sometimes behavior. That doesn't happen so much actually when you're in your 9 to 5 job. That's saved up by some people for their out of office events. But
yeah.
the employer effectively is still on duty at that point.
Mm,
They are still on the hook. And I think, whilst it may be incredibly hard to police everything, and it is really difficult, and the employer is often not in control of the situation, they are on the hook. They are vicariously liable for the acts in the course of employment,
mm,
unless they can show that they've taken all reasonable steps to prevent the act occurring.
yeah.
And then we get into, well, what's a reasonable step? Are we into things like issuing reminders before the event to say, well, yes, you're all going to have a good time, but here's our code of conduct, here's our dignity at work policy, here's our discrimination policy. I
Mm,
think sometimes employers don't want to do that. They almost feel as though, well, that's going to kill the mood, isn't it? But I think the responsible employer really does have to think about whether it takes those sorts of steps. It also has to think about things. Is it going to have an unlimited bar, for example, at some of these events? Is it going to perhaps take the managers to one side and say, look, you might want to enjoy yourself as well, but you're here in a senior capacity, and we're expecting some leadership. This is sort of top down behavioral expectations.
yeah. Yeah. Well, what's your take on? Because it felt to me like at one point with I touched on the petrol station forecourt case, which is very much a third party harassment case, physical attack of an employee on the petrol station forecourt, and it seemed like the courts it was quite a high watermark in terms of when the trigger for the employer's duty kicks in, and it was almost a very purposive approach to say we have to find that the employer was responsible for this, because without that, there's no remedy for the employee who's been brutally attacked. Even though this was, a customer effectively wandered onto the forecourt and very quickly in an unprovoked way ended up physically attacking the employee. I think a lot of employers read that back a few years ago now and must have thought, well, wow, when could you not be liable? Have we rode back from that a bit, do you think?
I think we possibly have. And again, I guess when it comes down to sort of refocusing, if you like, on new legislation and what it should or shouldn't include. Again, whether the very fact that the idea about new laws about party harassment have been rejected
Hmm.
as being
Yeah,
not a
indeed.
good idea. Whether that just sends things in a slightly different direction. But yeah, you're absolutely right, Adam, with the petrol forecourt one. I think it very much was a question of someone has to be held accountable. And there's been all sorts of cases, haven't there, for not just in terms of harassment, but for whether it's been data protection breaches or whatever,
Mm.
wherever it might be, where there's been some similar kind of concepts of, well, if the employer is not held liable, then no one will be. But
And often
um,
an insurance policy sitting behind that employer's liability as well. I think if you're slightly cynical, whether that be a data breach or a employer's liability insurance to weigh on the minds of the courts.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But I think, again, so as a starting point for all employers, it's always going to be, well, what steps can we take? So the moment they get into the mindset of, well, anything could happen, so therefore we're not going to bother, or we're going to take less responsibility because we can't control everything,
Mm.
um, then that's where it becomes dangerous, and you start to fall foul of all sorts of obligations. Whereas the starting point has to be, if you can say as an employer, we have done what we reasonably can to protect our staff, whether that's from internal threats or external ones. Again, just regardless of what the law might or might not say about third-party harassment, I think most responsible employers would want to ensure their place of work is a safe place of work as far as they can reasonably control it. And if employers are doing that, um, yes, you may still become unlucky. Of course, you could, but it's certainly going to be the foundation of, first of all, how you want to behave as an employer, and secondly, in terms of legal defence as well.
Yeah, well, you touched on another point there we wanted to cover today, which was you mentioned responsible employer, and I think we should just talk around this issue of what's the importance of this in the perception of a prospective or current employee. Do you think employees will, I mean, it'll vary, won't it, from different cohorts, but they look at companies' moral fibre when deciding to join or stay? I mean, there's been lots of factors, but how important do we think the reputation of an employer around providing this safe place of work, taking it seriously and being protective of their staff? How much does it weigh in the balance, do you think?
I think, Adam, it's absolutely a factor now. People have lots of different reasons for joining or for leaving companies. It might be career progression. It might be, remuneration issues. It might be, they want a different manager. But actually, a lot of people now don't want to be associated with a company that's had a bad press
Mm.
for the way it's either treated people or allowed people to be treated. And that includes, how it allows its staff to be treated from, its customers, its clients, its other business contacts. Nobody wants to um, be with an organization that probably sees the pursuit of profit, over and above somebody's safety, for example. If they go out on sort of a client meeting and they don't feel safe, and then they not only don't feel safe, but they feel that they don't have a voice within the company to be able to say that something's got to be done about this. But it is that um, sort of unthinkable sort of approach that some companies take, that they might not want to talk to that client or that customer because they're the the sort of the revenue generating sort of top customer client, and they fear that they might lose that if they raise an
Yeah.
uncomfortable issue with them. But absolutely, people want a workplace culture that they feel respected in, that they feel valued in, and this word safe. I think that word. I want to have a safe space. Used to be something people would perhaps talk about, in a non-work context, but it's become very much part of sort of workplace sort of parlance now, I think, to feel an entitlement to a safe space um, at work. And if you don't have that, then people are probably going to be unproductive anyway. There's going to be tensions, and people will go home and they'll think, well, actually, I'm dreading going into work tomorrow morning, so I'm going to start looking for somewhere where perhaps I do feel safer. I do feel that if I have an issue, it will be properly listened to and addressed. And I'm thinking a couple of years ago, there was a lot of bad press around Brewdog and the bar staff who are obviously on the front line of customers who, are having their own good time and take things a little bit too far, probably didn't feel that they were in an organization that treated reports of harassment particularly seriously. And you had, you had at that time a lot of issue with getting people into the hospitality industry. And I think the taint of that harassment, or the taint of a lack of concern over the harassment from Brewdog, really impacted on their recruitment. And a lot of people also left.
Yeah, I mean,
So they've, yeah.
hits the organisation in the pocket, doesn't it? Potentially as well. I mean, Will, we've got a tight labour market. You take Rebecca's example there. It may be that organisations like Brewdog are having to increase their wages to attract people to stay, and wondering why. And is it, why are we paying more than maybe our main competitors? And it could well be that that is a real material issue. I mean, some of those issues and allegations were at senior management level about the conduct of senior management themselves, wasn't it? So, I mean, do you see that as an issue that even if you can find the staff, one way or another, you're probably going to pay. You're either going to pay more to get them, or you're paying because you can't actually find people that will work for you at all.
Yeah, and I suppose again, we're using the example of the likes of Brewdog. Again, it's not, I guess it's not just the staffing issues; it's just the general damage that cause to their reputation as a brand, as
Yeah, we
well.
should say
So
we're not making any finding here or suggesting that any allegations were upheld or not.
No.
Just to manage that side of things. But yeah, carry on, Will.
as Rebecca says, this was it was around about 2 years ago now, and it's it's still very much fresh in people's minds. It's something that people still remember about them as an organisation. Again, the same's going to happen with more recent news with McDonald's, those sorts of things. It sticks in the mind, which is going to have a financial impact in other ways as well, isn't it? In terms of their the potential impact on their consumers. And once that damage is caused, it's very hard to unravel it. So, regardless of what an organisation might try and do later, try and fix the problem, you don't really hear about that in the press, do you? Yeah, everyone always for the bad news and the thing that the company did 5, 10 years ago, even. Once a reputation is tarnished like that, it sticks for a very long time. And as you say, whether the allegations are ultimately proven or not, once it's out there, and the public, that's what they get remembered by. So it's a very important issue from that that PR side, the damage to reputation, that can arise just simply by having a culture that gets left unchecked too long. And as Rebecca says, again from the company point of view, the turnover, the productivity, the sickness absence that can run together with the legal risks as well. And of course, if the culture gets unchecked for too long, there's potentially, that you have that organization where there's maybe a culture of a bit of fear with people afraid to speak up, and it gets worse and worse. And then all of a sudden, the dam bursts. The first person speaks out. Again, as we saw last week with McDonald's, it can unravel very, very quickly. And all of a sudden, what was quite a manageable situation, maybe, if for employers who can nip this in the bud early and have the right culture in place, are all of a sudden hit with an enormous storm of things to deal with. And the amount of, again, regardless of the legal risk, the PR risk, the damage to reputation, the amount of management time that then has to be devoted to trying to unpick all these grievances and all of that all at once, coming from all over the place, can be absolutely horrendous to deal with. So you're very well served to not allow that culture to fester, and get it right to start off with.
I think I was
Go
just
on,
going
Ray.
to say, I think we were talking about pay with Brewdog, what sort of things that they, potentially looked at doing to try and sort of alleviate some of these concerns that people perhaps had, or to um, the perception and move the narrative on. And they came up with a very innovative, bar staff could keep 50% of the
Yeah,
profits.
yeah,
So, incredibly radical. Now, not sure whether that was meant to, then sort of completely deflect from the harassment. It was so radical, it was almost okay, well, they're now remembered for this sort of 50% keeping of the bar takings, rather than necessarily the harassment. But I think it just shows it is the harassment side we probably do remember, rather than the fact that they put some more money into people's pockets. So
yeah,
that shows that it isn't all about the pay.
yeah. That's right. And I'm going to sound cynical today, particularly cynical, more cynical than I normally am. But if you think of the press and the media, it's rare that if ever, that you get a news story run to go, oh, those allegations that we ran a story on 6, 12 months ago, whatever, an investigation has been completed and there were findings that nothing bad had happened. That's not going to win when you're doing your round table in the newspaper of what's going to be our leader column. It isn't going to be that. So, as Will says, that what's left is never really heard, did we? But we're left with that sense of there was some bad stuff
Yeah.
said. And yeah, it's interesting what you say when we talk about pay, and we're touching on this issue now about how do you best ensure the right behaviours are exhibited. But the interesting thing, we'll look at that question, but in extreme cases, some employers might say, we're not looking to ensure the right behaviours are exhibited. We're changing the metrics of the relationship so that people still come and work for us, but they're those who are prepared to put up with that kind of environment. It's almost danger money, if I can put it in that blunt way. But so let's assume that our listeners are employers who aren't so much in that territory of sort of, we just pay you danger money and you come into work, and if you get harassed sexually or physically or whatever, then you've had your extra pay and you're happy to take the risk. For our listeners who are thinking, no, in real terms, how do we change the behaviour? This is the tricky question, isn't it? What do we do to ensure we've got, because it covers two things. You need to be seen to have taken steps to try and manage this risk. We know the legal risks are there, but you also do in real terms want the risk to be managed. Genuinely don't want this stuff happening. What can we do? Well, who's going first? This is the tricky one. Will, do you want
Yeah.
to go
No,
first?
absolutely. I mean, again, obviously, the starting point, again, it sounds a little bit boring, and something that lawyers will always quote, but obviously, policy documents are always going to be there as a starting point. But I would just simply putting a policy in place saying this is what we consider to be good behavior and bad behavior, and leave it at that, is not going to be nearly enough. You need to actually back that up with proper actions as well. However, the policy is still going to be an important starting point, simply because the number of times that we see cases go through, or potential cases going to tribunal, and it's often one of the first questions that gets asked, in terms of, well, where's your policy about it? If you're trying to defend yourself against an allegation of harassment, if the answer is we have no policy in place and we've got nothing in writing to tell our staff what behaviour we expect, that's a bad starting point, when trying to defend something like that. So it's important from that perspective. And then beyond that, again, obviously, education of staff is important, but also equally important, it's done the right way. Because again, from take snippets from some of the McDonald's stuff, there's stories of they had training, but the training compiled requiring managers to look at a video, and there was a manager, reports of managers with their iPads propped against the McFlurry machine on fast forward whilst they were making drinks, so they could just tick the box saying yes, done. So there's that side of it, and also, again, employers, I think, have to be really careful about what's doing it the wrong way, that it becomes to victim, it looks like victim blaming as a consequence, with, so people being dragged into looking at it from that perspective about, oh, these troublemakers, right? You need to be careful about striking that balance of not going so far one way, that say that the people who are genuine victims are then seen to be the troublemakers.
Yeah.
So that's important. But I think probably, the most important is really, again, coming back to Rebecca's point about the safe workplace, and part and parcel of that is having the right culture and mechanisms in place to allow employees to feel that they are able to raise concerns, genuine concerns that they have, in a safe way. Because again, you hear all these the horror stories of where these things build up, and people are just too afraid to speak out. They're being harassed by people who are senior to them, both in age and in terms of management structure. And they're junior, they're young, it's maybe their first job, and they don't know what to do about it. So that's, I think, a huge part of it, is giving sort of the employees the right tools to address it in the right way. Again, with a balance there of making sure that people don't go too far the other way, and allegations over nothing are raised. So of course, that's equally important. But it's a question of sort of developing that culture. Again, it's not an easy thing. There's not sort of one size fits all. And part of that is going to be for every organisation to run its own risk assessment as well, in terms of what areas might employees be subjected to harassment. And again, it may be different.
Understanding where the risks are. That's a good point. That you
Yeah,
need different approaches in different parts of the business. There,
yeah,
there may be
exactly.
there may be risks in two different parts of the business, but they're very different in how they manifest.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. It could even be simple things such as, some people do a lot of face-to-face interaction on phone lines, and it's all via email and phone. And again, sometimes what people post on an email, they
mm,
might not be brave to say face to face. So
yeah,
again, there's different risks in all sorts of areas. So it's a question of just thinking about your business, as you say, the different parts of it, identifying where these problems may lie, and the best solution to avoid it.
yeah.
I
There's a
think
point
as
there, Rebecca. Sorry, I was just going
yeah,
we talked about people feeling there's a culture where they can feel confident in coming forward. I think, to my mind, and what your take is on this, there's also a need to have a culture within managers and HR of feeling confident that you want to, really look at these issues and take them on, and not shy away, because it can be quite daunting. You get on your desk, if you're in HRBP, you get this maybe cross grievance, multiple grievance again, and you look and go, my goodness, these issues are really, really gritty, difficult things,
yeah, I
and you can
think
be put off.
yeah, absolutely. And it's that step back moment, isn't it? It's rather than
Mm,
thinking I've got a 9-page, list of concerns that's just been put on my desk. It's actually saying, well, I'm not the one usually that will have to determine these. That's going to be somebody else's job. I need to now show that we're acting fairly, that we've got a process for dealing with this, that the individual that's raised it isn't going to feel a nuisance, and they're
yeah,
not going to feel as though there's a detriment, to them by having raised it. And I think I was just going to add that to Will's points about, making sure that, matters are dealt with. But I also think making sure that individuals are, um, in an environment where they feel they can call bad behavior out, even if it's not bad
yeah,
behavior that's happened to them, but it's things that they have witnessed that has made, well, it might not even have made them feel uncomfortable, but they're aware that it could make others feel uncomfortable. So the ability to call bad behavior out. And I think the thing that sometimes, HR can struggle with is when an individual wants to just reference a particular matter. They don't want to take it as a formal grievance at that stage. They want to make HR aware. And I think you have sometimes too much of a black and white approach to, well, if you've raised a complaint, then you've absolutely got to go all the way with it.
yeah,
Whereas somebody
yeah,
might
indeed.
have just wanted to say, look, I want to make you aware because if something happens again, there's perhaps a pattern of, potential behaviour here. And I think HR need to move perhaps the dial away from it's either one thing or the other. It's either you don't complain, um, or or if you do
Yeah,
complain, it
it'll be
has to be
forgotten
a
about, or
formal
you have to go.
grievance.
Yeah, you have to go all the way
Yeah,
with it. Yeah.
because I think a lot of people, there will be acts of harassment that on their own might not appear overly serious, perhaps at a point in time. But those, it's like the microaggressions, once they start to be looked at, on a collective basis, actually, somebody here, there is a pattern of behavior and that then needs to be addressed. And it
Mm.
doesn't have to be a pattern of behavior towards one individual. It can have been, over a course of time to a number of individuals. But, HR or, the company are then responsible for dealing with that and preventing further, micro acts of harassment that are going to cause people to feel uncomfortable.
Yeah. Maybe that's our big takeaway from the session today. We talked about the apparently shifting underlying legal constructs here and protection of law. We talked about how that won't much matter because to the things like reputational harm and actually toxic workplace cultures and what they do to your business commercially and reputationally. But that in reality, you can't remove all risk like anything in life. But what we're saying is that what you're doing is seeking to minimize it, but actually maybe partly through that, it's about being authentic as an employer and saying that things happen, not being inauthentic in saying, well, we're an organization that nothing like this will ever happen in our organization. We manage it. We're all perfect individuals and we manage it to such a degree that it'll just never happen. And that there's the realism injection to say things will go wrong sometimes. We don't want that, but that's authentic and the reality. And it's about how we look to support each other and deal with it when it goes wrong. I don't know what you think of that, Will. Whether it's being brave enough to go, it will happen from time to time. We do all we reasonably can to prevent it, but we also focus very much on how do we respond when it does, rather than we can somehow make it never happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think the as nice as it would be to think of a world where no one ever gets harassed ever again, it's just not going to
Mm.
happen, is it? But there's always going to be, we're all human. Someone is going to say something either because it's in their or do something because it happens, unfortunately, to be in their nature, or possibly inadvertently. It's going to happen. But as you say, I agree with you entirely, Adam. I think it's all about how we deal with it. Do what we can do, whatever we possibly can to prevent it, and then it's about the reaction to dealing with it properly afterwards. Again, most importantly internally, but also from that perspective of externally as well in terms of PR and doing the right things from that perspective to
Yeah.
try and safeguard your reputation as best you can. But sometimes it is a question of owning the mistake, not looking for excuses, saying, "Look, okay, fine, this didn't go as we expected it to. We're happy to hold our hands up, and we're going to deal with this, and we're going to deal with it properly, and that's just as important."
Yeah, indeed. Well, maybe
Yeah.
and maybe it's revisiting those collaborative working sessions and training between team leaders and the people on the front line as managers that need to spot these things and deal with them in the right way with HR, making sure that kind of ethos is properly embedded. So, um,
Yeah.
yeah,
I mean, I don't think, we always see the words, we take a zero tolerance approach to harassment on policies and sometimes
yeah,
in, sort of company statements, etc. But, I don't think I've ever seen a company that's put out a message saying, come and work here, we have zero harassment, because it's simply recognised that's not possible. I think we all
yeah,
agree that's
indeed.
not possible.
And
All we can
actually,
really do, yeah.
maybe the messaging needs to change a bit, or it would be welcome if it didn't just say zero tolerance in that sort of authoritarian sort of way, but said, um, we do all we can to prevent these things happening, but we're here for those who have unfortunate experiences when it does. we support you. It's
Yeah.
more, it's focused more on the pastoral kind of side of things, without the fear though that, oh, that wording might make it look to a tribunal later that we didn't really try to prevent it. We kind of acknowledged and accepted it would happen, and so we haven't done. But I think it's a bit of both, isn't it? That we put the measures in place, but things do sometimes go wrong, and when they do, we will be there to support you. And for some employees, I think that will really resonate to say, yeah, it's authentic that they're recognizing these things happen, but it's about how we respond when they do. So that's been really really interesting discussion. Thank you both for that. Lots more. I mean, this subject, as Will said, we're not going to find a world when harassment never happens, so there will be a continuing further development in these areas, and we may come back to another discussion on it in a couple of years when we've got some shiny new bits of legislation, Will, on the horizon as well, that you've touched on there. But for now, thank you both very much for your time today. Quick reminder to our listeners to follow the podcast on LinkedIn, and you can also find news articles on the latest updates on our website as well, and you can follow the podcast from there. So thank you all very much for listening.